Hello there, everybody, and welcome to this joint Institute of Employment Rights and Campaign for Trade Union Freedom TUC Fringe. It's disappointing that we are not meeting in person, particularly as this year the Congress was supposed to be held in Liverpool, which I always love, but meeting online meant that yesterday I could attend the Wigan Diggers Festival. That's the first time I've been able to attend in its 10-year history, so that was good and it was a great day. So yes, good all round. But back to this evening's event. My name is Carolyn Jones. I'm the director of the Institute of Employment Rights, and before we start I'd like to say just a few thank yous. First, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening, both our audience and our panel. Thanks to my colleagues, James Harrison and Sarah Glenister, who are busying away behind the scenes and tweeting out information about our speakers. So do feel free to follow and retweet as the night goes on. Thanks to Morris Solicitors for sponsoring this event tonight and for their long-term commitment to the work of the Institute of Employment Rights. And finally, thanks to the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom for their ongoing work alongside the Institute, particularly Adrian Weir, Tony Burke and Andy Green, who are the current officers of the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom. Our theme tonight is a new deal for workers, and at the Institute we have spent the last 33 years arguing for a better deal for workers. Whether that is through improved employment rights, through stronger trade union freedoms, or through a greater central role for unions at the heart of the UK economy via sexual collective bargaining. And the theme for a new deal for workers runs through most of the 2021 Congress agenda, which I was reading and watching today. Motion after motion on the agenda touches on the policy issues around which workers demand more and around which the government could most certainly deliver better. The suggestion in Composite 1 that this moment should be treated as a 1945 moment was, I thought, spot on. Yes, we need to build back better, but we also need to put the case for a fundamental shift in the balance of power in the economy and in the workplace on the agenda. And to do that, we need to tackle the same social issues that were highlighted by Beveridge in his 1942 report, his 5 giant evils of want, disease, squalor, ignorance, and idleness. In 1945, it was needed to assist a post-war reconstruction. In 2021, it is needed to highlight a much-needed shift away from the political agenda based on austerity, cuts, and privatisation. Those policies are increasingly recognised as failing our economy and failing working class people. Last year, even the Financial Times declared the death of austerity, a loss which the FT said should not be mourned. And tonight, our excellent platform of speakers will address some of the problems caused by the policies of austerity and deregulation, outlining how their members suffer from the modern day incarnation of Beveridge's 5 giants of evil. We will also consider some of the policy options available for delivering a new deal for workers. And we have 5 speakers here tonight, so I doubt we will have much time for live questions and discussion, but feel free to place your comments and questions in chat, and perhaps our speakers will address them as the meeting goes on. And to kick us off tonight, we have the new General Secretary of Unison, Christina McAnear. Christina was elected to her new role in January this year, and while she may be new to her role as General Secretary, she's been working for many years with workers across the public sector, working at NALGO, initially as a women's officer, before it amalgamated into Unison, and as an AGS in Unison since 2018. I know for one that you had responsibilities for collective bargaining. That's just the area of work that I know about. So Now, Christina knows the problems, the issues, and no doubt has strong ideas about the kind of New Deal that we need. So I look forward to hearing your contribution and invite you, Christina, to address us now.
Thank you, Caroline. And can I thank the Institute for Employment Rights for organising and hosting this. It's a really important event for us. And I'm really proud that Unison was one of the founding members of the Institute for Employment Rights, and really happy that we continue to work closely with you and jointly with you to continue to make the case for collective bargaining, decent employment rights, and of course trade union freedom, all very important to all of us. But just a few things then about, I suppose, my thoughts, Unison's thoughts on some of the key issues that we're discussing this evening. It probably does, to an extent, bear repeating. I've been at the TUC this afternoon, and there's lots of speakers about it, but the pandemic has actually exposed the value of the hidden workers doing the most vital jobs. I'm sure we in this call are all well aware of that. The people who kept services running for the public in the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and not just the ones who, if you like, are easily visible. The nurses, the doctors, even care workers. Got a lot of publicity during it, and of course did absolutely vital work. And it's right that they were in the headlines. But actually, it's much wider than that, as we know. It's the refuse workers, it's teaching assistants, the caretakers, security guards, cleaners everywhere who kept buildings and safe, who were cleaning rooms as patients were getting discharged, housing officers, social workers, all of the staff who, even in my own union, people that don't get much mentioned, but things like, we have members who do things like keep the Thames barrier running and keep it safe. We have members who keep the Mersey tunnel open. All of these people continue to work throughout the pandemic. They still went to work. They still turned up. Many of them got on public transport to go to their work, because working from home for many of them was not an option. So it's really, I think it's a tribute to them, and indeed all the people who continue to work from home, that this is the time to be bold in our calls for a new deal. And there are I'll just concentrate on a few key areas, Caroline, if that's okay. I wanted to talk a bit about sick pay. The lack of sick pay, proper full pay during sickness absence, is appalling. We've got the worst rates in Europe. And how is that justified? How can that possibly be justified? And the pandemic, if anything, has made that situation even worse. And I'll use the care sector as an example of the impact of this. So very few care workers get more than statutory sick pay. And even during the pandemic, when we as a union were pushing the government in almost daily meetings, it felt like, certainly with civil servants, to set up an infection control fund. And one of the key things that I argued for there, and we did eventually get them to agree to this, was to make one of the criteria for accessing this infection control fund that was given to the care sector, the top criteria, when you see it written down, is to pay full pay during sickness absence. Now, you'd think that was a no-brainer. You're getting paid by the government to do it. Why won't you do it? Believe it or not, still around 1/3 of employers in the care sector still refuse to pay full sick pay during sickness absence. They use the fund for other things. And the reason some of them gave was it would set up wrong expectations, because people would think this was something you could get all the time. You couldn't make it up. That's an example of what actually goes on in the care sector, the way people are treated, the way staff doing fantastic jobs were actually treated. So having a proper campaign, fighting for sickness, proper full sick pay, proper sick pay for people when they're off, is incredibly important, even when it's proven that, for example, not paying it was a driver of infection. It was actually driving up infection rates, all proven, this is all evidence-based. It still wasn't good enough for some employers who have this built-in opposition to treating their staff in any way that's considered decent. So we do need legislation to make that a right for people. And just a bit about collective wins. So, as trade unionists, we're practical people. We, as a negotiator, my job has always been to basically do deals if you can, and if you can't, then you take the other step of industrial action. But most people want us to leave a set of negotiations where you feel you've achieved something, where you've got something for the members. And even with a Tory government at Westminster, we still try and make gains through collective bargaining or legal cases or using the legislation in some way. And we know that many employers, and the worry is that as we come through this pandemic, they will be looking to, in a sense, kind of cash in on some of the things that have happened, or using this uncertainty that exists in some sectors to continue to do things like keep fire and rehire tactics, to keep 0 hours contracts and say that this is necessary as the economy is going forward in order to maintain some kind of, in their view, economic certainty. Use that, the sort of ongoing use of the fake self-employment status that we're all familiar with. And also, as we come across quite regularly, is that cynical way of setting up trading arms of some description in a way to get out of collective bargaining arrangements. That's increasingly something that we see. We see it across a whole range of sectors, and we're constantly having to be on the ball to be ready to fight back against it. So we need a deal to actually stop some of the worst practices that we see in so many sectors. And I would also include in that things that might sound like absolutely basic, but the right to clear information on pay. So we have loads of members in sectors who, when they see their pay slip, it's really hard to work out what your hourly rate is or what your pay is, because of the way that it's worked out and the way it's delivered on the pay. And that makes a whole load of consequential employment rights more difficult to establish, because it's hard to work out what the rate of pay is. So things like having a proper way of explaining what somebody's pay rates are, I think, is an absolute minimum for us. We see this a lot in things like social care, but we also see it in areas like term time workers. It's a huge issue, a huge problem for our term time members. And I know that courts often use, I hesitate to say this with Lord John Hendy on the call to try and to say anything legal, but I know that courts often use that reasonable test. So they look at what's reasonable, and I think it used to be called the Clapham Omnibus test. Where what would a reasonably educated, someone who's got a reasonable understanding of things, how would they interpret the law? Does that seem reasonable to them? And I think that's, and I defy anyone to look at the myriad ways that, for example, term time pay is calculated for school support staff and say that that's reasonable. And that's why we end up having to pursue case after case after case. I think we've got hundreds of cases running at the moment about term time pay. So that's another, just basic things that should be taken for granted as standard rights. But we want to see a new post-Brexit public procurement bill give us the chance, so this is an additional thing, to put wage standards into public procurement, not just a living wage, but also a bid on quality, to make sure that bids are actually being based on quality, not about cutting things to the bone, such as pensions, maternity rights, holidays and pay. So that would be another key issue for us if we could get something like that incorporated into legislation. And also better and enforceable standards in public procurement, which should include being able to take account of issues like whether companies and providers use tax havens or have dubious funding structures, like the loan servicing model that we see in social care, where a parent company like a hedge fund will set up a care company as a trading organisation, and then they loan them the money to trade or run their business. And then the money that the care home gets, a big chunk of that is spent servicing the debt at rates like 15%, which, far above what you could get in any commercial way. It's just a front and a way to make money. And I'm sure there's probably some tax scam involved in all of this as well. So I think we need transparency and clarity in some of these things, and the commissioners of public services should have the right to take those into account and actually rule people out of being able to bid for public contracts. I'm conscious I said I wouldn't talk for very long, and I think I have, so I won't go on for much longer. Just to say, pay is obviously critical for us and where we go in terms of pay. And for one of the key things for us is, and we're doing a lot of work on this just now, is to try and make sure that it's not just about pay, but it's actually about ending the gender, race and disability pay gaps. And we're pushing very hard with employers to get them embedded in our collective bargaining. But we'd like to see much tougher laws on that, so that employers not only had to do it, but had to have a proper plan, action plan to deal with it at the end. Without doubt, you said it, Caroline, the law is heavily weighted in favour of employers at the moment, and that needs to be absolutely rebalanced. And I would say, I think if post-pandemic isn't the time for us to be bold and ambitious about what it is we want, then when is? So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really pleased to be working with the Institute to take some of these key things forward. Thank you.
Smashing. Thanks very much for that, Christina. And yes, the Unison have worked very closely with the Institute since we were set up, and we're very pleased to say that you've just agreed to become one of our vice presidents. So, and the reason is clear, our work together goes in tandem. We've just got, you mentioned the national minimum wage, you mentioned pay, gender gap, both of which we are writing publications on at the moment, and both of which Unison will be contributing to. So that is great. You also mentioned the concept that would any other reasonable employer do it. The problem at the moment is there's too many employers who are not reasonable, let alone in their policy and their attitude. So that's great to hear about your call for a post-Brexit public procurement bill. I'm sure we will be looking with you on that, but thanks very much for joining us. I know it's a busy evening and you've got other meetings to go to, but great to have you here. I will move on swiftly to our next speaker, and that is another general secretary. We're getting everywhere these days. Great to see you, Jo. Jo was elected as general secretary of UCU in 2019 after working in higher education at the universities of Leicester and Sheffield, serving for most of her career as a branch rep, I believe, and officer. Jo is also a recent recruit to the Institute and has just recently joined our executive committee, something we are very pleased about. Jo brings her knowledge tonight and experience of issues faced by workers in further and higher education, issues like the attacks on pensions and cuts to jobs, but also on the growing use of 0 hours contracts and precarious working in education. It's not just the gig economy, it's throughout a lot of our sector. UCU is fighting back. I know just in Liverpool alone, you're fighting back against the 47 redundancies threatened there, and I think, well, last I heard the number was down to 2, but has been 1. Woohoo! But even 1 job's too many when you're fighting for members' jobs. So great to have you here, and look forward to hearing from you tonight, Jo.
Thank you, Cad. Hello, everyone. Before I start, I should probably say my admiration of the IER was cemented when I was an academic, actually, and used to use the publications frequently and was very grateful for the research. So there we go. I guess one of the things that I sort of wanted to say this evening, and part of the spirit that UCU have brought with them, or that we've brought with us rather, to the TUC this week, is very much in line with some of the things that Christina was just saying, but it is workers who have really demonstrated during the pandemic the work that is of value to society, and that was really valued by fellow citizens, fellow colleagues, and, you know, depending on the type of work you do, the services and different communities that we cater to. So I'll start with education, who obviously are the members that UCU have. And if you think about education, I've actually been thinking back to this time last year, because you may remember UCU was caught in this huge UK-wide campaign to prevent the mass reopening of UK campuses. We were fully of the opinion, based on the kind of the scientific advice that we were getting at the time, that to reopen campuses without serious mitigations, and one of that being actually including not being at capacity, would just create hotspots of transmission centres in universities. We said that university halls of residences would go almost immediately into lockdown. And unfortunately, everything that we warned the government about, everything that we warned employers about, it actually happened even quicker than we had predicted and the scientific calculations that we were looking at. We saw in Glasgow first, then Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, major cities all around the UK, thousands and thousands of students trapped in their accommodation, paying top dollar to be there, often then on the receiving end of exploitative packages of food. In some instances, in the University of Manchester, when those students protested, they were racially profiled by the security guards of the university. At the same time, we were being told as a union that we were being hysterical, lovely gendered language there. Universities were flying students in, international cohorts of students in on private planes at the same time. So what I'm just wanting to remind everybody of is that the second wave that really began to occur from August, September onwards was predicted, and opportunities to avoid it being as catastrophic as it was were put forward by workers. And the very workers who put these solutions forward were then the ones that had to pick up the pieces. So in the case of UCU, and I say this as a former academic, your job went from being trying to, educate your students online and in the classroom to becoming therapists for your students and actually having to deliver pastoral care via, whether it's Zoom or Teams that your institution was using, whilst also being absolutely burnt out, having to, worry about your own health and safety because you were being compelled to come into work under management orders. And this was why UCU was the first union in the UK to successfully win a health and safety COVID ballot. That was the Northumbria branch. And they were able to keep our members, mostly safe throughout the pandemic. But the same wasn't the case for students who were lured back to campus because this government would not underwrite the sector. The leaders of the sector, vice chancellors, wouldn't put any real pressure on the government to do that either because they were so concerned about the competition they were in with each other. So UCU members and other university and college workers' health and safety was put at risk, and students' mental health and physical health was put at risk, the disastrous consequences laid bare. And we also have members in prisons who obviously deliver important education there, and they've also been in dispute over health and safety. So I know I've lingered on that a little bit, but I really want to take people back to exactly what that was like. And this was way before we had any idea of a vaccine or whatever. I know, we know that healthcare workers experience similar, being chastised for not treating disposable PPE as if it wasn't made with gold, that they needed to keep reusing it as if these things weren't, developed to be thrown away. But I do think out of this, there's a really important lesson because workers did really have to rely upon each other. And there was a really great video, I don't know if you've seen it, but I saw it this morning, released by the TUC, and it's someone going around, I think they sound like they're in Stafford or somewhere, and they're interviewing people about sick pay. And you can really see the penny dropping with a lot of people about how disgusting it is that sick pay is so low or non-existent for some workers. And I do think that there has been a moment and a potential for us to campaign as unions, where people have really realised there is a solidarity that exists amongst people and that perhaps have not really been exposed to them before, but how fragile your own kind of personal wealth and security is by the pandemic. I do think, sadly, the pandemic has also exposed, and maybe this is a good thing, depending on how soon you want the revolution, but it has exposed just how rigged the system is against working class people, who, as I say, many had little choice but to sacrifice their own health whilst doing their jobs. Christina mentioned sick pay. I just talked about the TUC video. As I say, the government, rather than actually underwrite potentially one of the most globally successful sectors that we have in terms of higher education, would rather see the global embarrassment that happened, actually. But what I do think in terms of where we go from here, and I'm just going to reference one of the motions that was debated and passed today, is we have a huge duty, and it's, I will echo a little bit actually, Cad, what you were saying at the beginning. We have a huge duty in the trade union movement to raise expectations, not just to people who are members of the labour movement, members of trade unions, but for all workers. And I was really happy to see that the TUC branded this Congress as being around dignity, because it's a concept that we've been talking about in UCU all year, and the complete lack of dignity that students were treated with over the last year, workers in education and workers across the board are frequently completely treated to conditions that are not dignified. And I think in some ways, that links very much to Barry's bill and John's bill that was debated last week as well. Actually reminding people that what we are asking for in some ways is the very bare minimum. It is not exceptional. We shouldn't be embarrassed about it. It's not even firebrand necessarily. It is something that has been well established, and as I say, is the bare minimum of what we should be asking for. And I do think that the general public get this. I have a lot of faith in people. I don't think that people don't want these things, and I don't think that it's a generational thing. I don't think it matters how old you are. You normally have an intergenerational experience, whether it's your children, your grandchildren, nieces, nephews, extended family members, friends. People understand what it's like to know that they grew up with a certain amount of security, but yet their loved ones who are in their 40s, 30s, 20s don't. I was even this weekend, I spent some time with my dad and we were waiting for a bus, and there was a load of fellas who were next to the bus stop, and my dad was like, why are they all hanging around here? What's going on? I was like, they're delivery drivers, Dad. They're waiting outside the McDonald's because they don't know if they've got any work until they get a call. And he was like, oh, that's really disgusting. And we started chatting about how, people used to have to do that in the past, and it's not a thing of the past. So again, I think that the duty is on us as trade unions to go out with that message and start talking to people, because it is about pay. I agree with what Christina was saying, but it is about dignity and respect. We have a motion on Tuesday, which is about giving workers more control over their lives. We brought a motion about lobbying for a 3-day weekend. I know lots of people always want to talk about what a 4-day working week would look like, but we want really to focus people on what do you want to do with your time? Like, let the employers figure out what a 4-day week will look like. What do you want to do with your time? And that relates very much to the kind of other issues that we work on in UCU, such as casualisation. In some of our institutions, people aren't just on fractional contracts, they're on a fractional contract. So they've got a 0.5 contract that's on like a 0.4 basis. It's disgraceful. They have to have several of them. During the pandemic, it meant that nobody could really exercise any autonomy over saying no to their bosses, because they knew if they didn't get picked last time. So they weren't waiting outside of McDonald's waiting to deliver Deliveroo, but their ability to actually not engage with the rules that have been presented to them are not that different. And nobody should really be trapped in that constant state of never being able to plan. And just to mention another big dispute that's on our horizon is pensions. It's the same, saving for your pension, leaving the labour capital relationship, being able to actually move on is another battle that I'm sure decades ago workers thought we'd won. And now we look at the value of people's pensions being taken frequently, whether that is my members in UCU, whether it's the NUM and their pension scheme, whether it's Royal Mail, we can see it across the board. So yeah, I'm really pleased that UCU supported the CWU motion today, which really called upon unions to come together to fight these ills. I'm really pleased, therefore, that Barry and John are here, because I think their contributions are doing really similar things. Because I think if we aren't speaking with one voice, even though things might be very different across the sectors, and drawing those parallels and comparisons, we're not raising people's expectations and aspirations. We're not asking people to be ambitious. We're not telling people this is a 1945 moment, which I agree with you. What we're doing is we're demurring from being honest with people and really saying, you're going to have to do these things. This is our role. This is your role. But I think we can do it. And I've already said to Dave, when he pitches around the UK and doing whatever it is that he's got planned, I'll be with him. So I will end there and pass back to you.
Smashing, thanks very much for that, Jo. Love your positive outlook there to finish us off. And I agree, people get it. You know, they do get it, and they are getting angry, and their expectations are heightened. And so it's great to see that the TUC unanimously calling for united work around what we do in the future. So great stuff, marvellous. Thank you for joining us tonight. That was smashing. I'll move on to our next speaker, and our next speaker is Professor Keith Ewan. Keith is a professor of public law at King's College London. I'll just embarrass you a little bit, Keith, and say he's recognised as a leading scholar in both labour and constitutional law. Obviously, as people will know, Keith is president of the Institute of Employment Rights and a vice president of the Campaign for Trade Union Freedoms. He works tirelessly with IER's network and experts as one of the team who drafted the section of the Labour Party manifesto on workplace rights, based as it was on our 2016 manifesto for labour law and our 2018 rolling out the manifesto. Keith is there all the time. He's hot off a plane today, I believe. So I don't know whether you're jet lagged or whatever, Keith, but thank you for joining us tonight, and screen is yours.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Cad. Perhaps I could begin by saying what a privilege it is for me to be sharing a platform with my General Secretary. It doesn't happen very often, but great when it does. And also, I mean, just to look at the title of the session tonight, I mean, we're talking about a new deal for workers. And I mean, it is, just thinking about this as I was listening to the other contributions. I mean, the first time this phrase was used was by Roosevelt in the 1930s as really part of his strategy for dealing with the economic crisis in the United States, which was then adopted, I think, in this country in the 1930s as well. And I think there were two aspects to that response. And one was the promotion by the state, or by the government, both in the US and in the UK, of collective bargaining as a way to advance workers' rights. And secondly was the realization that the state does have a responsibility through legislation to introduce tough laws to protect workers' rights. So I would say that you look at 1930, you roll on to 1944, to the ILO Declaration of Philadelphia. And there's always two features of that great document which stood out for me. One is a passage that says that workers are entitled to a just share of the fruits of progress, a just share. And that, I think, requires us to have some kind of understanding of what social justice means, about how we value jobs and how we determine how people are to be paid. And that should not be based on any basic economic calculus determined by the market. It requires a heavy hand of the state, in a sense, to assess the value of work and to reward people accordingly. And I think, I mean, what the pandemic has shown is that the need for that to be done is greater now because of the reliance that we have seen on so many people whose work has hitherto been so undervalued, yet whose work has been so critical to the future of this country, and indeed to our response in dealing with the public health emergency. So that was one kind of continuity. And the other continuity, of course, in the Declaration of Philadelphia, which was an international agreement, which the United Kingdom took part in, was the promotion of collective bargaining, again, as a way to advance workers' interests, not just to give workers a voice in determining what terms and conditions of employment should be, but also as the best way to raise wages along the lines that Christina spoke about earlier, and about enhancing dignity by giving people a voice in determining what their wages and working conditions would be. So that is, in a sense, when we're talking about the New Deal, there is a line, I think, that goes back from the crisis of today to the crisis of the Second World War and its aftermath, and before then to the economic crisis of the 1930s. And both of these the responses to both of these earlier crises, I think, were dictated by two basic underlying ideas. One is the need for fairness in determining how people are to be paid and rewarded. And secondly, the idea that people should be engaged through collective bargaining in what should be a form of joint regulation with the employer. But today, what I think we have in terms of a new deal, it seems to me that the problems are massive after what has effectively been 40 years of deregulation or very light touch regulation. And I would just say that I think, I won't go into any of these in any great detail, but I think there are 5 priority areas that we need to focus on. And each of these areas is massive and would occupy a progressive government, I think, for a long period of time. But the first of these, if I could just run through them, one is the question of status, which goes back to John's bill, successfully introduced in the Lords on Friday. And that's about ensuring that everyone who works for a living, anyone who works for someone else for a living, is entitled to the benefits of the labour laws which the state introduces. There should be no exceptions, no qualifications. Everybody should be protected. And this goes back, I think, to a very basic principle of labour law, and that is a principle of universality. There should be universal coverage and universal protection. This isn't a problem just about the gig economy. It's a problem now which is occupying all sectors of the economy, and even in some highly paid sectors, you see workers now being, or individuals being wrongly classified as workers in order to deny them access to remedies for unfair dismissal or redundancy payments. So this threefold categorization of status that we have is one which is now being ruthlessly exploited, I think, by bad employers in order to degrade workers' rights, to degrade their dignity, to pick up on a word that was used by Joe. Secondly, I think we need to attend to, again, going back to previous crises, we need a serious uplift in terms of the improvement of terms and conditions of employment. And I get the anger about this and the idea that people get this, but I think it is the level of employment standards in this country are genuinely shocking. How do we know that they are genuinely shocking? Well, here is, for example, there's an instrument called the European Social Charter, which is a document of the Council of Europe. We have signed up to this. The Tories actually took us into it in 1961. Under the Social Charter, there are various labour rights covering a wide range of issues. In the case of the United Kingdom, we have accepted, I think, 13 obligations set out in the Social Charter. The last time we were examined by the responsible authorities for our compliance or non-compliance with the Social Charter was in 2019. The Social Rights Committee of the Council of Europe found that we were in breach or non-compliance of 10 of the 13 provisions that we had accepted. That's 10 of the 13 minimum standards that we are not complying with. And that covers a wide range of issues, in the sense which are on the agenda of the TUC and others. We're talking about paid holidays. We're talking about this level of the minimum wage. We're talking about the fact that there is no overtime rate guaranteed by law. We're talking about inadequate laws on job security. And we're talking about the way in which trade union rights have been traduced over the last, 40 years now. So, and there are more in the sense, as I said, there's 10 provisions which are listed by the committee, which they find us not to be fully in compliance, well, not to be in compliance with at all. And in some cases, the violations are multiple. So not just a single violation of some of these individual provisions, particularly in the case of trade union rights, there are multiple violations or multiple reasons why we are not in compliance with the Charter. And we could go on and look also at the ILO, which again, and I'm not just talking about trade union rights, the ILO has signaled, somebody mentioned sick pay, our failure to comply with basic international standards on sick pay. The ILO has highlighted before the pandemic the problems about health and safety at work and the inadequate funding of the health and safety executive, has highlighted the fact that it's contrary to international law to require workers injured at work to have to pay for their own prescriptions for the medicines that are necessary to recover from the injuries which they have suffered. Issues which have been raised, very topical at the moment, about the use of prison labor by private companies. Again, these are issues which have been highlighted in the case of the United Kingdom for many, many years. And these chickens, I think, are now coming home to roost. So that would be the second issue. We need to raise standards, at least in line with our minimum legal obligations. Thirdly, there's a question of collective bargaining coverage, and I think John will cover this in his presentation, so I won't say much about it, but I think one thing I would say, I think what is happening is that we've seen a major decline in collective bargaining coverage since the beginning of the Thatcher era, when we had about 82% coverage, 4 in 5 workers covered by a collective agreement. That has now fallen to, I think, about 30%, about 1 in 3 workers now covered by a collective agreement now. And what that tells us, I think, to some extent, is that the state is successfully redefining the role of trade unions. And what is happening on our watch is that trade unions are becoming lobby organizations, pushing for changes to the law, or making representations to peer review bodies, or providing services to members as a principal activity. Now, these are all important, but in a sense, they undermine the key role of a trade union, which is to be engaged in a process of joint regulation with employers in order to regulate the terms and conditions of employment of their members and indeed of workers generally. And that is what the legal definition of a trade union is an organization to regulate relations, not to lobby on behalf of members or to provide services as a principal purpose of the organization. And we've got to rediscover that function. And to help us rediscover that function, I mean, it's unbelievable, but it's in the free trade agreement with the European Union, which everybody, I think, is embarrassed about, and which everybody has ignored. But the free trade agreement includes an obligation on the part of the British government effectively to implement the principle, the right, not the principle, the right to effective collective bargaining. That is a legal obligation, which is now binding on this country independently of other legal obligations, but a legal obligation refreshed by the free trade agreement. It's a principle now being promoted by the European Union in a legal instrument produced last year. And of course, it's a principle which is being promoted very actively by the labor movement in the United States under the new political leadership. But it's something we've got to take control of this agenda and to turn around these numbers on collective bargaining, not just to give us a voice, but also to give us a pay rise. The best way to get higher pay is to be engaged in a process of collective bargaining. So that would be my third agenda item. The fourth item on the agenda, I think, is better job security. And I think this takes us nicely to Barry's bill. And I think the problem of fire and rehire, the reason why we have this problem, in the sense it is a deep, it is a symptom of the extent to which labor standards have fallen in this country, the extent to which individual employment rights have declined, the extent to which trade unions have been pushed to the margins in many situations, the extent to which collective bargaining has collapsed in some sectors, particularly in the private sectors. We have created a space for employers to exploit with inadequate legal protection for workers. And I think the reason, because of that, I think this is not an easy question to deal with. And I think Barry, I mean, hopefully, what we will see when the bill is produced is that we will see serious steps being taken to fill some of these gaps. But in a sense, what it means is that we need to rebuild consultation and negotiation procedures collectively. We need to improve our unfair dismissal laws. We need to improve our redundancy laws. We need to improve the law on the contract of employment so employers don't take the power to change contractual terms unilaterally. I mean, it's outrageous that this should be permissible in this country in the 21st century. And we need also the power to give to trade unions, to free trade unions, to take effective defensive action on behalf of their members when faced with this practice of fire and rehire. The employers in the States talk about employment at will. We used to laugh at the American labor law system, which allows employment at will. That is to say, people to be fired on demand. But we're moving very closely to that in this country. And that is why Barry's bill is so important. And fifthly and finally, let me just say, I think the fifth and final item on our agenda is the need to accept the new architecture in the post-Brexit era. And in the post-Brexit era, we now live with these free trade agreements. And these free trade agreements, well, maybe they weren't as good as what we had under EU law, but these free trade agreements need to be mined. And we need to see what's in there, which will protect us, which will help us to advance the causes that we are seeking to advance. And I'll finish on this point. And basically, there are three provisions in the current agreement with the EU in Article 399. The first is there is a duty on the government to protect and promote social dialogue. What that means is that the government has a duty to do what the Scottish government has done with the TUC, which is to enter into some kind of economic contract with the TUC, or to do what the Welsh government is doing with the Welsh TUC, which is enter into some kind of social partnership arrangement as a matter of legal obligation. That is what should be happening at Westminster as a result of the free trade agreements. Secondly, there is a duty under the free trade agreements effectively to implement the core ILO standards. Now that's a big, big task for a British government because it means sweeping the legislation clean of all the restrictions on trade unions, which have been inherited since the 1980. But it's extraordinary that that provision should be in this agreement, that it should be agreed to by this government. But that is the obligation that they accepted. We have a responsibility now to ensure that they live up to this obligation, that people know about it, the parliamentarians know about it, that we live up to the obligations which Johnson has signed. And the third provision is the obligation to enforce, to implement all the other ILO conventions and all the provisions of the social charter that we have accepted. That is the legacy of Brexit, which in a sense would require us to rewrite the substance of our labour law. Paradoxically, contradictorily, however you want to describe it, but it is there in the agreement. And we have got to liberate these provisions from the agreement and make them work for us. So they're handing it to us on a plate. It's up to us to make the best of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Keith. Informative as ever. I don't know how you remember all that information, but it always informs me. So thanks very much. Sounds like the new deal is there. All we've got to do is take it. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much for that. I'll move on to our next speaker, who is John Hendy. John helped establish the Institute over 32 years ago and has been our chairperson ever since, guiding us through both the worst of the Tory years and the best of the Corbyn years. He was an advisor to Laura Pidcock and he's now advising Andy MacDonald, and that's on top of his day job, where he's a QC representing trade unions and some of the most important trade union cases over the last 4 decades. As has already been mentioned on Friday, John's status of workers bill successfully passed its second reading in the House of Lords. It'll go, well, I won't say any more. John will tell us about it, but there'll be links to it on our website, his speech, our briefing, and even a little quiz so that you can test yourself to know how much do you yourself know about what it means in terms of the status of workers issue. But for now, it's great just to have John here to speak to us. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Cad, and thanks to all our speakers this evening. I wanted to begin by reiterating something that Christina said earlier on, and that is the revelations of the COVID pandemic for labour law. It's been brought home to people in a way that I don't think many people appreciated before, that all the labour law that we've had built up over decades has not provided security of employment, security in the current job, security of hours, security of income, or security of health and safety. Our labour law is very, very defective. And of course, I accept and endorse what Joe said about the consciousness of solidarity, which has blossomed during this crisis. It's very important. Christina pointed out the need to change the law, and really those two things are two sides of the same coin, aren't they? Worker solidarity can change the law. Worker solidarity can also produce changes to improvements to the condition of work of working class people without changing the law. But if you're going to change the law, you can't do it without the organized support of the working class. I wanted to talk about three things this evening: sectoral collective bargaining, the status of workers bill, and the police crime and sentencing bill. It's inevitable when a lawyer talks about these things that they're going to look at what the role of the lawyer can be in assisting the struggle for the improvement of the condition of lives of ordinary people. And I think that Jo put her finger on it in speaking of the realization of injustice and the possibility of raising expectations and aspirations. So when we're talking about changing the law for the future, apart from Barry's bill, which really does have a prospect of becoming law, most of the things that we're identifying are changes to the law which we consider to be necessary. I say we, I mean everybody on the right side of the argument considers to be necessary and essential, but without much hope that they're going to be implemented in the near future. But by articulating what the changes ought to be, we are raising expectations and aspirations and demonstrating to people that there is an alternative from the misery that they're in at the moment, and that it is possible to have a structure which effectively improves life. And of course, Keith has identified the most fundamental of all changes, which is the restoration of sectoral collective bargaining, which was introduced by law, as he said, by Roosevelt in 1933, but smashed up by the Supreme Court within 2 years. And what was implemented after that was not sectoral collective bargaining, but anybody who studies American labor law knows, it's simply enterprise bargaining, and very, very difficult to establish at that. But sectoral collective bargaining is making a bit of a comeback now. The New Zealand government is passing legislation this year for what they call fair wage agreements, which is essentially a legal mechanism for establishing collective bargaining sector by sector. And there are movements even in the care sector where, as Christina pointed out, things are so deplorable that even Tories are accepting that there should be some sectoral minima which could be established by sectoral collective bargaining. I'd just like to reiterate the reasons why sectoral collective bargaining is so important. Keith has already mentioned some of them. The first thing he mentioned was universality. You can't have common standards without at least those standards being applicable across the particular sector. Secondly, sectoral collective bargaining can influence the distribution of power within an industry in a way in which enterprise bargaining simply doesn't do, because enterprise bargaining is by definition confined to the particular enterprise. Thirdly, sectoral collective bargaining can increase wages, which the effect of which is to increase demand in the economy, which is to also to increase the tax take of government, and to diminish the benefits spent by government. And sectoral collective bargaining in that sense is the way of achieving what Keith mentioned and extracted from the Declaration of Philadelphia of 1944, the workers' just share. It's the only way it can be done. You can't get a just share by simply increasing the national minimum wage, even if the government were prepared to go along with that. And when we're talking about shares, it's interesting to note that wage share, that's to say the share of the gross domestic policy which goes in wages rather than profits, has dramatically declined over the last 40 years. In 1979, wages took 65% of GDP. Now, or in 2017, wages took only 49%. It sounds a lot, but when you think that most people are wage earners, we're talking about 33 million wage earners in this country, whereas those that live on dividends and profits and rents are numbered in the 100,000s. So that's a decline of some 16% of transfer of wealth and income from the rich to the poor. Sectoral collective bargaining, as a fourth point, increases democracy and dignity at work. It's the only way in which workers can express themselves at work. It's the only way that they can have any say over the terms and conditions on which they work. And that fulfills another principle set out in the Declaration of Philadelphia, that fundamental instrument of the International Labour Organization, which said that labor is not a commodity. And what we've seen over the last 40 years, and in particular through the pandemic, is labor being treated precisely as a commodity, disposable, usable, and dumpable. The next point is that sectoral collective bargaining, there's a lot of research now that demonstrates this diminishes inequality at work, inequalities of all kinds, gender inequality, ethnic inequality, and of course, in particular, inequalities of income and wealth. That's the reason that the OECD is now promoting sectoral collective bargaining. The OECD, not a revolutionary organization. One understands why the ILO is putting it forward, but the OECD, and it's done that in its economic outlook for the last 4 years, from 2017 onwards. Finally, sectoral collective bargaining is important because it's required by international law, by the ILO, by the European Social Charter, and as Keith has elegantly pointed out, by Article 399, subparagraph 5 of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement between the EU and the UK, which was signed on the 30th of December last year. And by the way, Keith, I'm pleased to say that I got in the first mention of Article 3995 on Wednesday in the House of Lords. Their lordships didn't know what I was talking about, but I tried to explain it anyway. And as Keith has mentioned, the problem in Britain, of course, is that collective bargaining coverage has declined from, as he said, 82% in 1979. It was in fact 85% from the end of the Second World War to the middle of the 1970s. 85% of workers covered by collective agreement. And since the day of Thatcher's election in 1979, it's fallen. And I think Keith's figure is a little optimistic in saying that it's about 33% now. The latest figure was in 2018 when it was said to be 26%. I think we can assume that the figure has fallen in the last 3 years. I always think that it's just around 20%, maybe a bit higher than that. So we've got a major deficit in collective bargaining coverage, and that coverage can only be made up by sectoral collective bargaining. You can't organise a workforce of 33 million people enterprise by enterprise, although obviously for trade unions, that's probably the only option they've got at the present time. So the second thing I wanted to mention, I'll deal with it very quickly, Cad, because I can see the clock. Status of Workers Bill was introduced for the second reading, which is one of the stages before a bill becomes an act of Parliament. On Friday last, it was supported from all sides of the House of Lords, including from the Tories, judges, crossbenchers and bishops. The only opposition came from the minister himself and one solitary Tory Lord. Of course, we know that the Tories will wreck this at a later stage of the proceeding. I expect that, but at least we're having a fight over it, and at least we are able to point to workers to say there are people fighting to improve the quality of your lives. That sole Tory had the cheek to make a speech in which he suggested that it was arrogance on my part in suggesting that workers might like the idea of having all the rights of employees, and instead of being deprived of them by being fake self-employed, or what the lawyers call limby workers, or operating under abusive personal service companies. But finally, Kat, I wanted to use this opportunity to draw attention to the next battle we've got. It's been fought already in the Commons. We're fighting it in the Lords on Tuesday, and that's the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill. It's relevant to the industrial matters we're talking about today, because it's going to put yet further restrictions on the right to picket. The right to picket has been part of British statute law since 1875. Of course, we know it's been restricted since. It was restricted by the Thatcher legislation, which was not repealed by Mr. Blair and Mr. Brown, and it was further restricted by the Trade Union Act of 2016. What's being proposed now is restrictions on public assemblies and processions. And one of the grounds for doing that is that is by giving the Secretary of State power to introduce regulations to make provision about the meaning of this phrase, serious disruption to the activities of an organization which are carried on in the vicinity of a public assembly, where you can see immediately that picketing might fall into that category, depending on how serious disruption was defined. Well, the government have introduced an illustrative draft statutory instrument setting out the regulation. And what they have in mind is that serious disruption might include, quote, significant delay to the supply of a time-sensitive product impacting on the community, or, quote, prolonged physical disruption to access essential goods and services impacting on the community. Well, it doesn't take a genius to see that if ASDA workers started a picket, an ASDA shop or a distribution depot, because we're talking about food that goes off, that would fall into the category of a time-sensitive product and would give the police power to restrict or prevent such picketing. And it doesn't take a genius to see either that if RMT started picketing underground stations, as they were proposing the week before last in a dispute, which I gather has gone into further negotiations, that would count as disruption to essential services impacting the community, and would deprive them of the opportunity of carrying out picketing, not just at underground stations, but anywhere on the railway, because whatever they did would involve prolonged physical disruption if they were persuading people not to work. So this is very, very dangerous legislation for trade unionists and for workers, just as it is for the Roma people who are threatened by it, and Extinction Rebellion, and many, many other people who wish to peacefully protest against the policies of government. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much for that, John. Brilliant as ever. And you're quite right. I mean, how are we to get a just share of just share from what we produce if all that is given to individuals is the right to request from employers, whether that's in health and safety, whether it's in flexibility, or whether it's in pay and conditions? That gives you nothing. And what we need is sectoral collective bargaining, providing a voice for workers. And your bill, brilliant. It raises the issues and shows how easy it could be to correct some of the fundamental weaknesses in our law if only the political will exists. Hopefully sometime in the future it will, but yeah, we will keep everybody informed of how that bill is going through the Lord. So thanks very much for that, John. That was great. I'm going to move swiftly on to our last speaker, who is Barry Gardner. Barry is the Labour MP for Brent North and has been an MP, a constituency, since May 1997. He's served as Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change and as Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade from 2016 to 20. He knows all about free trade deals. He's been a consistently good friend to the Institute over the years, so we're very pleased he can join us here tonight. As has already been said, Barry recently won the right to table a private members bill in the House of Commons and chose the issue of fire and rehire as the subject of his bill. A bill that will have its second reading on the 27th of October. So Barry, welcome, and over to you to update us on this important campaign.
Thanks so much. And can I thank every one of the previous speakers, not just for what they've said tonight, but Christina and Joe for the way in which their unions have supported this campaign, along with 20 other unions, but they've been absolutely magnificent. And Keith and John, because look, Keith and John were very polite in calling it my bill, but they're the guys who wrote this. I mean, let's be honest about it. I don't have the expertise to have done what they've done in drafting this legislation. So it'll go into Parliament, or it's gone into Parliament under my name, but the evil geniuses behind it are the other two guys here on the panel. Why did I choose it? Why make this the subject of the private members bill? Because just for those who are listening who may not know what a private members bill is, it's a bloody odd piece of legislation, quite honestly. You know, an MP sticks their name into a tombola like you would have at any school fete, and if they're lucky enough to be picked out in the draw, what they get is not a bottle of whiskey. What they get is time, parliamentary time. And that parliamentary time allows them to introduce legislation of their own choosing. So there's the question, why choose this piece of legislation? And the answer is exactly in what Joe talked about. And it's that word dignity. Dignity. And John put it in fancy terms, of course. He put it in legal aids. He called it labor is not a commodity. He went back to that declaration and gave you chapter and verse. But for most of us, it's about dignity. And when I launched the campaign in Banbury, there was a woman there who said, this was at Jacobs Dow Edinburgh, the coffee company. And she said, you know, they used to be really good people to work for. And then the asset strippers came in, Melrose, I think it was. And since then, it's just been awful. She said, my family has given over 100 years of loyal service to this company. My father worked here. I've worked here for 34 years. My husband works here and my son works here. And they've treated us with contempt. And so, yes, this bill's about lots of things and it makes lots of connections with the 92 Act and all sorts of other pieces of labor legislation. But at the heart of it, what are we doing? We're trying to say that this is immoral. It is wrong that you can go into work one day and your boss can say to you, you're fired. But don't worry, if you want your job back, just come in tomorrow and sign a new contract that will give you 12,000, £15,000 less each year. And I think Keith called it, I made a note of it somewhere. I can't find it now. There was so much I had to note down when Keith was talking. But it was the unilateral tearing up of a contract. How can it be right that it's just, they can do that, not just to one person, but to a whole workforce? It was 291 people at JDE in Banbury, 291 people. And they said, that's it, you're out, or you have to accept £12,000 off your pay. Now, that is what we have to take on board. That's what we have to articulate, and it's what we have to fight against, and it's what we have to change the legislation for. And, you know, in politics, you'll end up with some pretty strange bedfellows, because it may surprise you to know that Boris Johnson said, this is unacceptable. It may surprise you to know that Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary himself, said that these are bully boy tactics. It may surprise you to know that Jacob Rees-Mogg told the House of Commons, I tell all my capitalist friends that this is no way to do capitalism. Now, the question has to then be, if on the one hand, you've got Jacob Rees-Mogg agreeing with Dr. Joe Grady, agreeing with Mr. Len McCluskey, why the hell can't we legislate on this? Surely if we all recognize it's wrong, then we should legislate. But the government says no. The government says, no, what we're going to do is we're just going to tweak the guidelines. And we're going to say that we don't like it, but we're not going to stop it. Oh, you know, I don't know what my granny would make of that. You know, you think it's wrong, you don't like it, but you're not going to do anything to stop it. You're a naughty boy, just get on with it, Boris. You know, so what we've got to do is we've got to try and bring those Tories with us. And those of you who know my disposition will know that I'm more of an attack dog than a conciliator in these things when it comes to the Tories. And it's been tough. But I'm saying to the Tories, look, I know that private members' business happens on a Friday morning. And I know that's when your surgery is. So I'm damn sure that you're not going to come into the House of Commons on a Friday morning to vote against my bill. But you're not going to come into the House of Commons on a Friday morning to vote for my bill. You wouldn't want to stay at home, in your surgery, in your constituency. So I'm not asking you to come and vote against your own whip. What I'm asking you to do is to have a word with your whip. Go into the whip's office, speak to them, and say to them, look, we all agree this is wrong. So can't the government just change its position here? Can't you let this bill go through second reading into the committee stage? And that's why we've got this whole campaign around the bill. Because, you know, look, I've been all across the country. I've been down to Somerset, that's Jacob Rees-Mogg territory, down to the Clark's shoe factory down there, their headquarters. And I tell you, there was a lesson for me in dignity there. Because one of the guys who was on that demonstration outside of Clark's shoes, it was a lovely day. We were on that sort of green common. This is where the original Clark's brothers, they set up a model enterprise there that was really good for their workers. They were Quakers, they believed in it. And he called me to one side and he said, do you mind if we just move over, because I don't want my children to hear. And so I moved over onto the grass with him and he said, look, I want you to understand what this fight means to me. It would be £10,000 off my wages. And at the moment, I have a flat that has 2 bedrooms. And the reason it has 2 bedrooms is because of my children over there. My wife and I were separated. And every second week, I have the children. So if I lose this fight, if I have to sign that contract, I won't just lose my flat, I'll lose my family as well. And I think we've got to make those Tories feel so dirty that this is the sort of thing that is happening to people in their constituencies, that they go and they talk to the government and they get the government to change its mind and they get them to back the bill. And that's why we're doing it in the way that we are in this campaign, so that tomorrow, when MPs come back after the weekend, they'll have a goodie bag. They'll have a goodie bag from me. It'll have a nice little newsletter in it. Here we go. Nice little newsletter. And in the middle of that newsletter, it'll have a map with all the places on it where there's fire and rehire in their constituency. And there'll be mugs that say stop fire and rehire, and there'll be balloons, and there'll be all sorts of, there'll even be sweeties in there for them. It's a goodie bag because I want them talking. I want them talking amongst themselves saying, what is this? I've got a goodie bag from Barry Gardiner and his private members bill. I want them talking to each other because this summer I've been going around getting the trades councils to write to those Tory MPs and say, please come and talk to us about fire and rehire. I want them going into that whip's office and saying, bloody hell, what is all this fire and rehire stuff? I've even had my trades council on to me asking me to go and speak to them. Nobody ever contacts me from the trades council. And that's why we've got different stages of the campaign. Yes, we'll be at the party conference, just like we're here at the TUC conference. And we've got a huge hub just there by the entrance in the prism near the security zone for the conference. But we've also got an art exhibition. And you've got to think to yourself, what the hell's an art exhibition got to do with fire and rehire? Well, we're going to win this by educating the public. We're going to win this by making people out there realize that actually this is something that affects people's lives, that could affect their life. In fact, probably is affecting somebody they know or somebody in their own family. So please get your paintbrushes out, get your glue pots out, make me a sculpture, take me a photograph, send it in. There's a huge, big, major financial prize, but the financial prize is not nearly as big as the legislative prize. But we only win the legislative prize if what we do is we get people talking about it, if we get people doing what they did with the Free School Meals campaign and saying, you know what, that government, they're letting kids go hungry. And the Tory MPs felt so ridiculously bad about it that they had to do something. They didn't wake up one day and think, gosh, do you know what? Children aren't getting fed properly in the school holidays. We'd better do something about that. No. They knew damn well that kids weren't getting fed properly in the holidays, but it was the public opprobrium. It was that sense that they felt unclean about it that forced them to do something. And we've got to do the same with fire and rehire. And that's why you've got an art exhibition. That's why we're going to be having a stakeholder conference. That's why I'm speaking with the CBI. I'm speaking with the British Chamber. Because I want everybody to understand that this is wrong. It's about human dignity, just as Joe said. So please, write letters to Tory MPs. Get onto them. Make them realize that there's a whole swathe, thousands of people out there. Each union has the power to contact thousands of its members, to galvanize them into writing to those Tories, into putting that pressure on. And that's what will win this bill. I can't win it in Parliament, no matter how great the rhetorical flourishes. We can only win this bill by concerted, united action. And my God, if the trade union movement's about anything, surely it's about that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Barry, for that passionate and progressive and inclusive campaign that you have started. I'm sure you'll get the support of the TUC this week. I note there is a few resolutions on the agenda on fire and rehire. I know that the Institute will be supporting your work. In fact, we've got a roundtable discussion planned in the Northwest to discuss just that and to provide some more of the living examples that you say are out there. And later in the year, we will be producing, Keith kindly wills with some others, a publication on why we need to stop this, the growth in this practice of fire and rehire. I would say one thing as a side, you could fund this campaign, I suspect, by developing your Jacob Rees-Mogg impersonation. I, for one, would pay to come and see you doing that at a social event at the Labour Party. So keep it up. It is brilliant. Got no idea, by the way, what a screechy is, but if I heard you correctly, but I'm sure everyone will be talking about it, and good luck with that. We will continue to promote it on our website, and I'm sure, as I can see from the chat box, that you have got the interest and people talking about it here. So thank you very much for that. Now, I'm going to say thank you to everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you to Christina, who had to leave, to Joe, to Keith, to John, and to Barry for giving up your time on a Sunday evening. It's great to see you all here. Thank you to our audience who have joined us and who engaged with the chat shout box. Hope the rest of TUC goes well, because that's what this fringe is about, the TUC week. We will see you at a fringe at the Labour Party. That one's going to be in person, so if you're in Brighton, come and join us. I'm sure there will be information about that, but most of all, if you don't get the Institute stuff, sign up, get our weekly news brief, which is brilliant and keeps you up to date with everything, and we look forward to seeing you all again at our next event. So thanks.